Hey there. So, the vice president, Kamala Harris, said something really stupid and really inconsistent, and so we're going to talk about that, okay? If you missed it in your daily doom scrolling, in a nutshell, Kamala Harris went on her first visit to another country in her role as Vice President of the United States. Oftentimes, these visits are philanthropic in nature. Sometimes it's for optics and outreach. Other times, it's to project strength. The country that the Vice President chose to go to was Guatemala. Now, before I go over what Kamala said, I want us to enjoy a brief history lesson together about the nation of Guatemala. Trust me, it will all become very relevant. So, Guatemala. Guatemala had indigenous people living there as far back as 18,000 BC. They developed rich cultures, trade, and complex networks with other indigenous bands or nations in the region. In 1519, the first Spanish colonizers arrived in Guatemala. Hernan Cortez, fresh off of his pillaging of Mexico, handed over the reins to the Alvarado brothers to conquer the region that would become Guatemala. Captain Alvarado presented himself as an ally to one of the indigenous nations to help them fight against a rival nation, only to turn on them and bring the entire region under Spanish rule. This is the first time that a foreign power would intervene in local conflicts to influence an outcome in their favor. It would not be the last. The country would go through most of the 1800s dealing with various regime changes and the internal clashes that go along with that. Oh, and this was also the same time that industries in the United States started eyeing South American nations for commercial purposes. The United Fruit Company would go on to displace native farmers and eventually destroy millions of acres of land through monocultures and pesticides. During this period, Guatemala had pro-capitalist heads of state who made several concessions to these companies. When the country elected anti-capitalist leaders, Guatemala would go on to host a revolution, brought about by protest and a general strike in response to the brutal working conditions at the plantations. After a few replacements performed coups on one another, a military junta took control of the country and organized the first free elections. They elected a pro-nationalist, pro-capitalist conservative writer who instituted harsh crackdowns on communist and criminalized unions in the workplace. This guy, who was named Arevalo, had survived several coup attempts and was legally prohibited from participating in the next election. In the next election, they would go on to elect a pro-worker president named Arbenz. Now, remember what I said earlier about how smoothly things go when the US and US-based corporations liked the leader? To keep it really short and sweet, the CIA trained and armed hundreds of counter-revolutionary fighters to invade Guatemala. They coupled this with a psychological campaign of fear and doubt, ultimately forcing out Arbenz. The replacement that they helped install reversed his policies of transferring uncultivated land to the peasant laborers. There was a couple more coups and another junta where the CIA again got involved. Also in 1966, the US sent Green Berets to train and arm right-wing counterinsurgent gangs. These groups would go on to evolve, and we would go on to call them death squads. All of this started way back in the 50s and continued well into the 90s. In the 80s, the US-backed Guatemalan government massacred hundreds of indigenous protesters. With the glowing support of Ronald War Criminal Reagan, the leaders of Guatemala, which I remind you we helped install, would engage in scorched earth warfare, torture, and forced disappearances. Documentation has come out and shown the true horror that the United States helped bring upon the Guatemalan people, all in the name of corporate interests. 45,000 activists were missing and unaccounted for. Many of the targets were students, laborers, and protesters, not to mention the effects on the indigenous people of the region. Over 400 Maya villages were razed to the ground. The Guatemalan government has spent the last 2 decades gathering evidence and charging the regime leaders with crimes, and it's showing no signs of stopping. So that's a brief history about Guatemala. Now let's address what the Veep said. She went to Guatemala, and I remind you, on her first overseas visit. And she told them, don't come. Don't come to America. The tired, huddled masses yearning to be free, don't come to our borders. Really, Kamala? From the child of 2 immigrants, no less? You don't get to tell them not to come. You see, as a country, we've spent the better part of a century making their country unlivable. To this day, there are thousands of people taking up arms to fight against pro-capitalist militaries in these South American countries, but there are also thousands of people who have had their farms torched and their families' lives threatened. And I haven't even gotten into the effects that COVID-19 has had on that country. I think that the vice president could use a history lesson, and certainly she owes an apology to the millions of voters in the United States that brought her administration into power on the promise that we would see an end to the Trump-era immigration policies. You don't get to tell them to not come. You don't get to say that there are legal routes to citizenship. The U.S. didn't wait for permission to come to Guatemala in the first place, and what they did wasn't exactly legal. Check yourself, cop. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and make sure to click subscribe and the little bell. Also, sound off in the comments about other parts of the world that the United States creates refugees in that they would later turn away. Also, follow me on Twitch, and make sure to follow me on Twitter where I show you my favorite recipe for huevos rancheros. And if you're so inclined to support the channel, I do have a Patreon. Thanks again. Thank you.